Welcome back. Over 150 organizations urge elected leaders to secure vital education programs currently funded by expiring federal COVID-19 stimulus money ending in June 2024. This threat predates Mayor Adams' recent 14% agency budget cut to each agency, including NYCPS. Joining us now is the Policy Director at Advocates for Children of New York, Randi Levine, and Vice President of Government and Community Relations at Good Shepherd Services, Minguez Garcia. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Now, can you elaborate on the significance of the federal COVID-19 stimulus funding that New York City Public Schools, also known as NYCPS, has received over the last few years, and how has it been utilized to support educational programs?
So thank you so much for having us again. The New York City Public Schools received $1 billion, $1 billion of funding, all of which will be expiring next year. And as we know today, they use the funds to expand programs like community schools, a model used to support the whole child, which includes everyone in the school, families, communities. They supported schools to hold them harmless. This was really around enrollment. They supported students during COVID and when they were returning to in-person instruction. But they also use funds to create programs like shelter-based coordinators or to pay for existing programs like those that support young people who are over age and undercredited. I'll pause there so that Randy can step in and kind of give you more of the specifics.
Thanks, Annie. That $1 billion is specifically the amount of funding New York City Public Schools is using this year to support schools and educational programs with long-term needs that aren't going away when the COVID-19 federal funds expire. And so in addition to the programs that get mentioned, thinking about 3K, preschool for 2-year-olds, preschool special education classes and services for children with disabilities, 450 school social workers, also psychologists, nurses, bilingual support, translation and interpretation, and the list.
Now, it may have been touched on a little bit, but I want to emphasize how how this has been used to not only address pandemic-related challenges, but to launch and expand essential programs. Can you provide specific examples of these programs and their impact on students and the education system?
Sure. There are so many programs that have been launched or expanded with this funding. And these programs are especially designed to meet the needs of the students who need the most support. So for example, preschool special education classes for young children with autism and other significant disabilities. Even though children have a right to these classes, hundreds and hundreds of children were sitting at home without the seats they needed because the Department of Education didn't have those classes. Well, they used some of this funding in order to provide those classes. Hiring 450 school social workers. We work with so many students who need additional support in school, and those social workers can be a huge help to students. Coordinators who work in shelters to help students who are homeless get to school every day. Increasing the number of community schools that provide wraparound support to students so that they're not only getting help with academics, but all sorts of additional programming to help students and their families.
Now, I also want to highlight something that's so important. You talked about how, students with disabilities and, students from underserved communities are honestly going to see the potential consequences of this. Can you just explain why it's so important to kind of highlight that and, put these students at the forefront of this issue?
Absolutely. We often hear about students homeless and students with disabilities who are being left behind and overlooked by the education system and not getting the support they need. So the rate of absenteeism, for example, the chronic absenteeism among students in shelter missing 10% or more of the school year is over 60%. And having staff at the shelters who can help students get to school, who can help with enrollment and transportation is critical. And we're talking about the expiration of this funding at a time when thousands and thousands of additional newly arrived immigrant students have enrolled in our schools and are living in our shelters. So having support for them in particular, both in our schools and in our shelters, is particularly important. And I know that Annie can also talk about the way that some of these programs are particularly having an impact for students with the greatest needs.
Yeah, I think I also want to just mention that, we were seeing a lot of these needs before COVID, and COVID exacerbated some of those needs. And these are programs that were needed even before COVID. So here we are now looking at the expiration of these funds and are very concerned, especially as Randy mentioned, with the new arrivals, and that we're supporting them in after school, we're supporting them in our community schools, we're supporting them in our transfer schools. We are seeing the migrants everywhere, and we're not getting additional funding to support them. But when we see the additional cuts that the mayor is proposing to address the migrant crisis, on top of the fact that we're going to be losing all of these amazing supports that were brought together during COVID, we have a lot of concerns of the future of our New York City public schools and the way that they're going to be able to support young people and families across New York City.
Now, you just said something that stood out to me, and that was, so many of these issues that we're currently facing, the school system has been facing them long before COVID. Can you just talk about what that experience was like, and how so many people within the educational system had to work to, I don't want to say get out of it because, so many people are still dealing with it, but can you just talk about what that experience was like?
Sure, and really we can give examples with each of these programs and why they were needed and how much they were needed before the pandemic and how they're still going to be needed after. Just as one example, when we look at the 450 school social workers who were hired with this funding, we have had a long-standing need for additional social workers in our schools that far predates the pandemic. And even with this investment, there's only one school social worker for every 435 students enrolled in New York City schools. And still today, more than 240,000 New York City students don't have access to a full-time social worker in their school. So we certainly don't want to go backwards. We want to be moving forward. And at a minimum, we have to ensure that we sustain this investment and the others that were made that have been needed for so long and that the DOE was finally able to help provide during the pandemic because of this federal funding. Again, there's much more work to do in each area, but we need to make sure that we're moving forward and not taking a massive step backwards.
Now, in a step to move forward, there's a call to action by more than 150 organizations. Can you tell us more about this campaign and what specific actions these organizations are urging elected leaders to take?
Do you want to start on that one, Annie?
Yes. So this is not only the call is not only for elected officials; it's also for community members. But for our elected officials, we are saying we as community members, community organizations, parents, young people need to be at the table as the city decides how we are going to operate after these funds expire. We also need to have conversations about how do we sustain all of these important programs, and especially as we see that the New York City Public Schools also used some funds to cover existing programs that are supporting young people and families across New York City. So we are coming together with one voice to say that we will not uh, falter and say save this program instead of this one, because we know that all of these supports are needed, especially now after COVID. And we are inviting community members and young people to also join the call of action and to help all of us understand how our city is going to move forward.
Now, could you elaborate on the broader consequences for the education system and for students if these programs are not sustained beyond June 2024? And I thought it was so interesting that it's like young people, of course, they feel that sometimes their voice may not be heard, but there is something that, I guess that they can do. Can you just talk about like what they can do and, what could the consequences be in the future if we actually do see these changes made?
Yeah, so
All
I'll
right.
kind of like start. There's one particular program that is supporting young people that was started about 20 years ago, really to support the city with an over a high rate of dropout rates. So we were looking at how can we support young people between the ages of 17 and 21 to still be able to get a high school diploma. And about 17,000 young people currently have taken advantage of this program and have high school degrees because of these programs. And we are seeing the dropout rate lower in the city. So I say to the young people that are in those programs right now, or other young people who might be seeing us, we can be leveraging our social media. We can be talking to our elected officials. We are the ones that, along with the city, can really make a difference on what is going to happen. We have young people who are in our community schools, in communities that were hardest hit by COVID. If those resources go away, we're talking about food pantries, we're talking about social emotional supports, we're talking about vision or hearing mobile bands. So many different resources that our communities needed, and the time to come and join us in the advocacy is now. We have until June to support the city in determining how they're going to either shift resources to continue to support the Department of Education, but also to talk about what do you want to see in your communities. Let's talk about community by community, what investments have been made, what you want to continue to see, what else you need in those communities.
And Randy, did you want to add to that? I know you were going to speak in the beginning as well.
Sure, the consequences are enormous. So we're talking about children who will turn 3 and will not have seats in the city's 3K program because the city has doubled the number of 3-year-olds in 3K using this temporary funding that will be expiring. We're talking about young children with autism who will not get the services or the class that they need. We're talking about students and families who won't have summer rising. We're talking about students who won't have access to social workers, school nurses, or psychologists in school. And so many additional programs that are at risk and so many consequences for our students. So as Annie said, we're asking community members, parents, educators, youth to join with us and calling on elected leaders at all levels to develop a plan now. The city and the state have the funding, and we need to see it invested in sustaining these important programs.
And this also made me think. We talked like when I automatically think about schools, and how this affects our schools. I think about younger children, but I wonder how is this also going to affect high school students who are in a really sensitive part in their lives where what they do in high school could impact how well they do in college, and could also impact the rest of their lives. How do we see this impact older students, ages 13, 14 to 17, 18?
Yeah, so we have, as part of the long list of programs that have been supported by federal COVID dollars, we have programs that have been supporting young people in a college, creating a college going culture within the schools. Without these programs, what we're going to see is less young people being even exposed to what college is about. And so that this is a great concern to us. Without some of the funding that's currently there, we're going to see that our dropout rate for older young people will probably go up, because they will not have the supports that they have had in place for almost 20 years. We have the the expansion that was done with community schools, and really looking at the supports that families and communities needed across. We went from 216 to 416, so over 200 schools now that have additional funds to really address the needs in those communities. Without that funding, we are very concerned about what's going to happen in those communities, knowing that the needs were there before COVID and were only exacerbated after COVID.
Now, given the urgency of the situation, what are some potential solutions or alternative funding sources that elected leaders could consider to sustain these critical educational programs?
Like
Well, we
Randy
can
said, we have been having conversations with electeds at all levels, and that's why we need other community members to also join us in the conversation, looking at state, federal dollars that can be available. What we know to date, and I want folks to kind of understand, is that no one's going to be able to give us a whole entire $1 billion, right? And so we need to get very we have to be at the table. We have to have really serious conversations about where can we get supports to continue all of these critical services.
Now, I also want to know we've been talking about the programs in kind of like a broad sense, but what has the feedback or the outcomes been like for some of the students who have been affected by this? And do you know any students or have worked with any young people who you've seen them grow or their life change from being a part of some of these really amazing educational programs that are now being threatened?
I'll tell you with Good Shepherd Services, some of our young people that have participated in our Learning to Work program move on to support us in a college prep program that we have at Brookwood Lifelink. Sometimes they come back to the young adult borough centers where they graduated from to be themselves program directors. So we have seen successes within our program. And again, just think that we're not going to be able to see that if these programs just come to a complete halt at the end of the next fiscal year, this fiscal year.
And Randy, did you want to add to that, or do you have any experience or have seen, a child or a young person kind of grow from being a part of these programs?
definitely, and we can give examples from so many of these programs, and that's what is so I think important for folks to know is that so many of these programs are at risk. So again, just to give a couple of examples, shelter-based coordinators. We have seen shelter-based coordinators who have helped families and children living in shelter to resolve the challenges that they were facing when they couldn't get to school, to figure out what are the transportation options that students have so that they could start attending school on a regular basis, which makes a huge difference in their lives. Or a young child with a disability who had been sitting at home for months until finally this funding came in and a new class opened where the child could finally start getting the instruction and services that they need. And we've heard from families who have talked about what a difference that has made to their child's ability to communicate, to participate with other children, to really prepare for kindergarten. And so from our youngest children to our oldest students, we have seen the impact of these programs in so many ways. And so many of these programs are just getting off the ground. And so we're excited to keep working on strengthening these programs, but we need elected leaders to find the funding to keep them going.
And Randy, I kind of want to expand on that a little bit more. Can you just talk about your organization, Advocates for Children of New York? I think it's so important to highlight some of these organizations that have been, that are doing some of this work to make sure that these programs stay around. We heard a little bit about Good Shepherd Services, and we're going to learn a little bit more. But for the time being, can you tell us about Advocates for Children of New York?
Sure, we focus on education, and our main work is providing direct assistance to families. So we have a helpline that we encourage families to call whenever they have questions or concerns about the education system. The number is 866-427-6033. And we'll try to help families get the support they need with the New York City public school system. And it's through helping thousands and thousands of individual families that we've seen these barriers for so long, and we've seen how some of these solutions have helped individual children. And that's why it's so important that we advocate to keep these programs going.
And I also want to highlight once again that, this is a call to action by more than 150 organizations, which means to some extent there is this sense of collaborating and kind of hearing each other out. Can you talk about, the importance of understanding that, we may be different organizations that may have smaller different goals, but there's this one goal that unites all these organizations. Can you just talk about the importance of understanding that and collabing?
We are facing such a big threat right now, And it's been wonderful to see so many organizations come together and recognize the importance of sustaining these programs. That it's not about one program or another, it's not about competing. New York City and New York State need to find the resources to sustain these programs that have been needed for so long and are still needed today. And Annie might want to add to that as well.
Yeah, I think we have a history in New York City of nonprofits coming together, but 150, I don't think I've seen since the Bloomberg age when Campaign for Children was formed. And the reason why we're coming together is because we know that we're not going to be able to impact the city in the way that we need to influence them to ensure that all of these supports are available past June 2024 without all of us coming together under one voice and not negotiating against each other, not saying one program is more important than the other. As you've noticed, we are trying to advocate for everything on this list because we understand that they all complement each other. They're interconnected. If I don't have where to take my 3-year-old, I will not be able to work. Possibly my older child might not be able to go to high school. There's so many interconnectedness, so many stories, and we want to uplift those as part of this campaign.
Now, I want to hear both of your opinions. What role does public awareness and grassroots activism play in advancing social justice causes, including equitable access to education?
This is where we want to say that without public input, we as organizations can only do but so much. When our elected officials are seeing you at the supermarket and you are talking to them about an issue that you care about, they are listening. When they go to the local laundromat and they hear someone else talking about the same issue, they're paying attention. When they go to the senior center and they hear grandma talking about her great grandchild is not going to have 3K, that matters. And so we're saying, we want you to join us in this because we as organizations have now organized and we want to make sure that we create a space for community members to be heard, for the participants that we support to be heard. And that's how we're going to be successful.
And Randy, could you, add to that? I'd really like to hear your opinion on how, social justice and just kind of like grassroots activism can kind of impact this type of work.
Grassroots activism is critical. I talked during this interview about the impact that a preschool special education class can have on the life of a child, but to hear it from that child's parent is so much more impactful. I talked during this interview about the impact of a social worker, but hearing from a young person the difference that the social worker made to them in their school is so much more impactful. And so we definitely want to partner with parents, with youth, with educators, with communities to make sure that all of us are raising our voices and calling on elected officials to save these programs.
Now, lastly, what is the long-term vision for education in New York City? I know this is a kind of a loaded question because I'm sure there's so many goals and so many things that, people in this field want to accomplish. But what is the long-term vision for education in our city? And how do these critical programs align with the vision in terms of ensuring quality education for all students, regardless of their background or circumstances?
One of the reasons it's so important for our elected leaders to come up with a plan for sustaining these programs now is so that we can secure their stability and their success and build on the progress made and not have to worry every day that we're going to be cutting back on that progress. Because, for example, Advocates for Children get so many calls from parents whose children are having difficulty learning to read in school. Part of this funding has gone to initiatives that help with literacy and that help students with dyslexia. We need to be building on that and doing more, and certainly not cutting back. It's important to ensure that every child has the high quality early childhood education that they need. And so we praise the administration for using this funding for 3K, for preschool special education, but we need to keep that moving forward and not take steps back. It's great to provide students with the holistic support they need in school through community schools, through social workers, through nurses. And again, we want to keep moving forward in that work and not take steps backwards. And then to provide those individual supports to students based on their specific needs, whether we're talking about students with disabilities, English language learners, immigrant students, students who are homeless. And so we appreciate the fact that the administration has invested some of this funding in support specifically for those populations. And our vision includes providing more tailored support. And so at this moment, we need to at least ensure that we are able to keep the programs that have been put in place over the past couple of years.
And I know to some people this may seem like like an issue for like maybe people who work in education or people who have students or children. But how can we engage in a broader societal conversation about the link between education, social justice, and economic opportunity to mobilize the support for the sustained funding of critical educational programs?
Happy to start and give it to Annie, sorry. Education is key to the future of this city. Anyone who cares about the economics of the city, who cares about the well-being of our citizens, has to care about education. If we want to break the cycle of homelessness, if we want to break the cycle of poverty, education is key. And education provides so much support both to students as well as to families. So this is really an issue that everyone should be concerned about.
And I appreciate you mentioning that because I think that even for myself, sometimes we tend to think of these issues as like things that exist within the vacuum, like, oh, this is this problem. But you mentioned it so well that it kind of affects every aspect of our city. And this is exactly why so many different people, no matter what age or no matter what your familial status is, that you should care about it. And I want to just, thank you both so much for joining us to have this conversation and to talk about why people in our city and even across the country should care about this. So once again, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.